Thank you very much, Grigoriy. It's a big pleasure to be here and a privilege. And since I only have 10 minutes to play the devil's advocate role, I'll jump straight to the point. So, okay. Okay, so these are the 11 Eastern European countries that have introduced the second pillar over the last 2 decades. And you can see that in 10 out of those 11 countries, we have seen reform reversals. Now, this picture alone tells you that there is something very wrong in second pillar in Eastern Europe. The reform reversals basically went from dismantling the second pillar only 1 year after it was introduced in Czech Republic, to dismantling more than a decade after it was introduced in Hungary, and to almost dismantling in Poland, as Dariusz said. And besides this dismantling of the second pillar, we have also seen many examples of significant reduction in the second pillar by reducing the second pillar contribution rate significantly in countries like Slovakia, Latvia, Lithuania. And the most recent trend that we are seeing right now in countries like Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Croatia is that the legislators are changing the laws and allowing the workers to return from the second pillar to the first pillar because they realize they will have a larger pension in the first pillar than if they stay in the second. And as we speak, Croatian government is adopting the law to allow more than 97% of second pillar participants to return to the pay-as-you-go system because it was estimated that they will have higher pension in the pay-as-you-go system. So I will try to draw 3 lessons on why this disappointing performance in second pillar in Eastern Europe occurred. The first lesson is about political economy. And it's really simple. The pension reform should be about pensioners, period. It has nothing to do with economic growth, with development of markets, with reducing shadow economy. Unfortunately, if you look at the processes in Eastern Europe, when pension reforms were being discussed, most of the talk was actually about how second pillar introduction will help you increase economic growth, increase national savings, even combat shadow economy because supposedly workers will now be voluntarily willing to pay taxes because they will have so much trust in the second pillar. And in a large part of the responsibility for this lies actually in this influential and highly controversial World Bank study that actually put forward its claims. Now, as economists now see, this was nothing more but basically lobbying. Now there is firm evidence that second pillar did not increase economic growth or help combating shadow economy in any of the reforming countries. So you need to focus on pensioners because remember, we are all pensioners sooner or later, and look at their benefits. Don't look at this supposed side benefit of economic growth because this will not happen. Now, one thing that many lobbyists in Eastern Europe got wrong is that they were thinking that it's enough to get political support to introduce the second pillar and that's it, you're set for life. Well, you're not. You have to maintain that political support for the next 50 years while these pension funds mature, because if you don't maintain that support, if you don't introduce the second pillar on valid economic grounds that will actually benefit the people, then the political momentum will change, and then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from the introduction, you will see a reversal that you are now seeing in Eastern Europe. Now, moving from political economy to public finance. Lesson number 2 is do not carve out second pillar from the pay-as-you-go system. If you look at developed countries in Western Europe, in North America, private pension system in all those countries basically are supplementary pension system. They are on top of the existing public pension systems. Only in Latin America and Eastern Europe, this controversial idea of carving out the private pension pillar from the pay-as-you-go system was introduced. Now, when you carve out the second pillar from the first pillar by basically diverting pension contributions to the second pillar, you create a massive deficit in the public system and in the government budget. Chile managed to cover this deficit with the support of Pinochet regime, and they managed to have huge surpluses for decades. But enabling those surpluses in a kind of Eastern European or in a democratic setting, it's much harder. So many reforming countries in Eastern Europe actually failed to implement these austerity measures and to close down the deficit that second pillar introduced. So what happens if you introduce the second pillar and you don't close down the deficit that it introduced? So this is what happens. So first you have a simple pay-as-you-go system where you take the money from workers, governments collect it and distribute it to pensioners. Now you have a second pillar. You divert those contributions to the second pillar, but you don't close the gap in the government. So the government now doesn't have the money to pay out pensions. So now the government is taking the money from the second pillar in order to pay out pensions. So this kind of second pillar, it's not really pension privatization. This is basically circular transactions and basically pay-go financing in disguise. Now, not only is this pay-go financing in disguise, but this is also inferior to pay-go finances because, as Dariusz says, this increases your budget deficit, this increases your public debt, and this also decreases the value of your pensions because it is well known that private pension funds charge very high fees in all countries. And one of the rare virtues of the pay-as-you-go system is actually it has low costs. So this was the case actually in many countries. In Hungary, Poland, Argentina, 60% of second pillar portfolios was in government debt. In Croatia and in Romania, it's even worse now, it's 70%. So it's obvious that if you have this situation, the government will have an incentive to do what basically Poland did, to close down these circular transactions, to go down to a simple pay-as-you-go system. Now, you might think that this will not be an issue for Ukraine because at face value, Ukraine is not planning a carve-out pension privatization. What formally Ukraine is planning is to increase the second pillar contributions without reducing the first pillar contributions. But if you remember what happened in 2006, when you had a drastic cut in the first pillar contributions that led big deficit that is going to stay for decades in the public pension system. So if you take a reference point as 2015, then Ukrainian plans are exactly to carve out the second pillar contribution. And I would say that this is a very likely outcome if Ukraine goes with the second pillar now. Now, if this actually happens, then in 15 years or so, there will be a political opportunity to do three things at the same time. Reduce public debt, reduce budget deficit, and increase pensions by doing basically the Polish type of reform reversal. Now my question to you is, how many Ukrainian politicians will find this idea appealing? Or how many politicians in any country will find this idea appealing? This is something that you need to think of now, not in 15 years. But coming to my last lesson is that suppose that against all odds, Ukraine somehow manages to avoid these circular transactions and gets the second pillar without them. There have been certainly cases of second pillar introduction in Eastern Europe that was introduced in fiscally prudent manner where these circular transactions were basically avoided. And these are the Baltic countries, Bulgaria, and Slovakia. So let's look at the performance in those countries. Now, you know that the basic advantage of funded pillar over a pay-as-you-go system is that it should allow for higher pensions than the pay-as-you-go system. The pay-as-you-go system basically can allow the workers to have an implicit rate of return equal to GDP growth. Now, it has been established in all developed countries that capital returns are higher than GDP growth, so the funded pillar should allow the workers to have high rates of return than GDP growth. But look at what happened in these 5 countries. In all 5 countries, the rate of return on a funded pillar is significantly lower than rate of GDP growth. So basically, the funded pillar were basically giving the workers less than what they have been earning in a pay-as-you-go system. And that's why all these countries decide to reduce the second pillar, because the most obvious example is Latvia. Latvia has this NDC system where people in the first pillar earn the rate of return equal to GDP growth, and the second pillar, they're earning negative real rate of return. They're losing money. So it's obvious that all this reduction in the second pillar were actually benefiting the pensioners. Now, if you look at the literature and try to explain how come this came about in Eastern Europe, because by looking at the standard economic textbook, this is not what you should be seeing. You should be seeing that the returns to capital are higher than GDP growth. And in Eastern Europe, they're not. So if you look at the literature, many authors try to explain this perverse outcome by basically pointing to unsupportive precondition in developing countries in Eastern Europe. Some say it's the undeveloped local markets. Some say it's lack of supervisory capacity. Some say it's lack of financial literacy. Okay, so if this is the right explanation of why we are seeing this disappointing performance, then that must mean that the second pillar on mandatory individual accounts are working great in the developed countries, where these unsupporting preconditions are not present. So let's find a developed country that has a well-established mandatory individual account system. Well, it turns out that this is almost impossible to do, because the mandatory individual account system has been dismissed in basically all developed countries. There was a big push in the United States under George W. Bush to introduce them. It was dismissed in the United States. It was dismissed in Canada, France, Germany. Entire Western Europe basically dismissed mandatory individual accounts idea. Now, you might hear that mandatory private pension funds work very well in countries like Switzerland or Netherlands. That's true, but those private pension funds are completely different. They are not individual accounts, they are collective pension funds, defined benefit systems that provide much better support to workers than the defined individual accounts. So basically, the only developed country that has mandatory individual accounts is Australia. So let's see whether Australia is managing to get good performance out of the individual accounts. And one very interesting thing about Australia is that before Australia introduced individual accounts in '92, they had a very developed system of occupational pensions. So it's very instructive to compare the performance of occupational pensions and individual accounts in Australia. And as you can see, the occupational pensions, which you might hear from many reformers in Eastern Europe, are seen as supposedly not good for workers because it's the employers who choose the asset allocation and supposedly they don't care about the workers. You can see that the performance of occupational employer not-for-profit funds was vastly superior to retail individual accounts in Australia. And what is even more striking is that people are not switching from those retail funds which are having very low performance compared to occupational funds, despite the fact that Australia is one of the most financially literate countries in the world. These people, 40% of Australians almost, are not switching to not-for-profit funds, which would allow them almost twice as high pension. So this tells you that in the individual accounts and pension markets, there are serious cases of market failures, and free competition and free choice don't provide good outputs and good results in an individual account framework. And here it boils down to marketing or on companies attracting the contributors. And it was estimated in Chile, for example, that the marketing elasticity was 19 times higher than the price elasticity. So basically it was all about marketing. Now, correcting for this market failure is very hard.
You say that.
Yes. And my last point is that the only way to try to correct for this is to try to go with this default life cycle portfolio that you have in Sweden. And I'll conclude at that and continue after.
Yeah, that sounds the